Hello, everyone. I'm Candace Montgomery, Senior Vice President and General Manager of Atlantic Live. And welcome to our ongoing series, The Atlantic's Progress Report, the State of the Latino Community. We are so glad you could join us today. Let's jump right in. Latinos have fought against labels and misrepresentations, unequal economic opportunities, widening wealth and education gaps, and more for centuries. However, the ongoing pandemic and the social justice movement have significantly impacted the community's economics, education, and even identity. So where do we go from here? This afternoon, through a series of conversations, we will examine the state of progress among Latinos in America, and will outline how we can harness this community's power to enact sustainable changes that will yield long-term success. There's a lot to talk about, but before we dive in, I'd like to thank our underwriter, the MacArthur Foundation, for their support of the Atlantic's journalism today. Also, I want to remind all of you home that you can participate in the conversation via the Q&A tab. Please tell us where you're from, and if you ask a question for our speakers, we can incorporate it into the conversation. Now, let's get started. For a conversation about leaning into our identity, what it means to be Latino today, please welcome Linda Yvette Chavez, co-creator and executive producer of Netflix's Gentefied, and Paola Ramos, author, Emmy Award-winning journalist, and Latinx advocate. Here to lead the conversation is Atlantic contributor Jamel Hill.
Welcome and hello, everyone. And thank you, most importantly, Paola and Linda, for joining us for this special conversation about the diversity within the Latino community. With no hesitation, let's dive right in because we don't have a lot of time and we have certainly a lot of topics and issues that we want to get to. So a question I want to ask both of you, but Paola, I'll start with you. There is a rush, or at least a desire, it seems, to blanket the Latino community in verbiage in terms of what we call Latinos within this community. We want to create almost a universal identity. So I would love to ask you, is that something that's dangerous to try to create a universal identity? And does one even exist for the Latino community?
Of course. First of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here today. I feel like the best story that came out of the 2020 election was this statement, no? Latinos are not a monolith, no? And that is the core of our story. That is absolutely right. We look many different ways. We speak many different languages. There's Afro-Latinos, trans-Latinos, queer Latinos. There's indigenous folks, no? We come from Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela. We're completely different. I do like to think, though, that regardless of where we come from, regardless of our socioeconomic status, regardless of whether or not we're documented or undocumented, there's one thing that I think Latinos do have in common, no? And is this idea that there is someone in our family, someone down our line, that came to this country for the very same reason. And that was to, in this country, find a little bit more freedom, a little bit more rights and opportunities than the ones that we left behind. And so as Latinos, I feel like that is the core thing in this moment and in such a polarized country that we live in. That principle, of being empathetic, of wanting to lean into our liberties and our rights, that to me is a very Latino principle that I feel like we don't talk enough about.
Linda, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we're not a monolith. Paula just described, there's so many countries, so many racial identities, so many statuses that we are, so many different parts of our identity that are hard to define. And I think America and this country have often, I don't think there's a huge understanding of that. And I think it's starting to get unpacked in the last few years. I know there's been many scholars and activists who've been doing it for generations, but obviously with everything that's happened in the past few years, more and more of it's being put out there on social media, more and more having access to knowledge and the ability to unpack what they've not understood all this time, how they've been misunderstood by this country for so long. And our identities are so specific down to where we're from. I identify as Chicana from LA because I think that's a very specific cultural identity. Mexican American to me is a very specific cultural identity. It's not the same as just being Mexican or just being American. And I think that conversation can be confusing for some, but the realities of our stories as first-gen Americans are different. And I think that's part of, I often say, part of the bigger issue in Hollywood and the industry that I'm in, where there's just not enough representation across the board for all the different identities that do exist in our community. And we're barely, honestly, even though there's been many over the past few decades, many shows and pieces of media that depict parts of our communities, it's not nearly enough to depict, I forget how many countries, 30 something countries, and all the different racial identities. Like, it's just, how do you begin to really represent all of that? And I think that that's a huge undertaking that we have as a community. How we come together to do that, I think we're still figuring that out. There's a lot to be discussed and unpacked, and hopefully we get there.
Linda, you're definitely right in the sense that we certainly like to label people in this country, and even more in particular, we like to make people one thing or the other without giving sort of birth to the nuance of whatever the situation is. One of the things that I think people have noticed, that there is debates over what Latinos and Hispanics and all those that fit under the multitude of rainbows within the Latino community, what they want to be called. And one of the words that seems to, depending on who you talk to, draw a little bit of controversy is Latinx. Now, Paula, can you just explain to people maybe the origin of where Latinx came from and why this has become such a divisive issue within the Latino community?
Completely. So the term Latinx, and I think there's something about that X that, as you said, really spooks people. But the term really starts to pop up in these online circles in the early 2000s, right? And it originally was meant to simply be inclusive of queer folks, right, and gender nonconforming folks within the Latino community. The interesting thing about this term, though, is that suddenly through 2000s, to this moment, if you even look at the Google spikes and Google trends, more people start to search this word, right? Trying to understand, what does it mean? And then also suddenly people in activist circles and media, friends and family start to use this word, going beyond sort of queer Latinos. Suddenly you have undocumented folks using it, you have Afro-Latinos using it, and you have English Latinos speakers using it. So it becomes more than just that. The way that I like to define Latinx is, in this moment, it's not a perfect word. No, it's not a perfect terminology, but in this moment, I feel like it is the only word that at least attempts to paint a more realistic picture of who the over 60 million Latinos are in this country. Now, typically when you think of Latino, Latina, Hispanic, there's an image that comes to mind. Latinx at least attempts to break that stereotype, and it makes people feel uncomfortable. And so I always go back to the beginning of your question, which is, why is it so controversial? And that, I think, is what is worth unpacking, because there's something about that image of Latinos. There's something about the image of myself standing next to an Afro-Latina, standing next to a trans Latino, to an indigenous Latino. There's something about that image that people are not ready to see. It just rubs people the wrong way. They don't like to see themselves in that image. And so that's why I think it's so important to talk about language.
Linda, where do you think that comes from? Why do you think, as Paula described, that this is bothersome to people?
I mean, so many of us have grown up internalizing so many types of oppressions, right? We've grown up being told we're not good enough in so many different ways. I think if I think about within my own family or my own lineage, like, I have indigenous ancestry, and I know that historically in a place like Mexico or other Latin American countries, I can't think of a better word other than disappearing that part of your identity, making that part of your identity invisible, has been such a big part of the narrative. I wish I knew the exact policies that went down in Mexico so I could talk through them. Maybe Paula can, but there's so much around the idea of this Latino identity unifying us, but there's so much about that identity also erasing parts of us. That's the word. Erasing parts of us that are Black and brown, that are historically in our communities, or queer or trans, or all of the, like Paula said, all the different parts of us. And so I think there's a lot of discomfort with not feeling unified as a culture. And I think there was a lot of policy in different Latin American countries that really pushed for that unification to erase those parts of us. And now I think the fear of like digging into and saying like, no, these parts of us exist, and they're okay to honor and to separate and to discuss how they're being oppressed, how indigenous communities are being oppressed in our community, how Afro-Latino folks are being oppressed in our communities. That's okay. It's okay for us to unpack and to separate in order to find some sort of healing. And I feel like people are scared of that, very, very terrified by it. I mean, truthfully, for a long time, I didn't identify as Latino post-college because I really understood the machinations of that, like how that was working. But then at some point, as I was working in the industry in the last few years, there was a call for unification amongst these different identities. And how do we unify? How do we use that term? I'm not sure. I still identify, like I said, as Chicana. But I know that in order to overcome a lot of the challenges that we have, for example, my industry, there is a unification that needs to happen in order to fight that good fight. But you can't have that fight without acknowledging what's there, what's really happening within our own communities, the oppression that's happening even from our own people. So I think there's a lot around that that's uncomfortable. Like Paula said, it's uncomfortable. Like many things, you don't want to sit with that discomfort and acknowledge how you participate in those oppressions. And we really can't make progress until we do that. If that makes sense.
Since we're on the subject of complicated terms, let me bring another one to you, Linda. Latinidad, which is meant to cover Black and Indigenous Latinos. There are some who are for this word. There are some that are against it. Can you explain what this word means and why there is such a divisive debate within the community about it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I'm the expert to speak on that. Maybe Paula will have some more about that. But from what I understand with Latinidad, similar to the word Latino, like it's again a term to unify the community, but it's, I think, rooted in policies that are not that don't acknowledge those parts of our community, Indigenous and Afro-Latino members of our community, which, I think a lot of scholars and activists in the community, thank God for them for doing the work to bring up how Latinidad really erases those identities from the conversation and makes it difficult to speak up about how we within our own community are oppressive of those in our community. I think there's this imagined identity here in the U.S. of what Latino is, like Paula described. It's the Bad Bunnies. It's it's the folks that like often are more white, to be frank. And I think that the way that race and racism is happening here in the U.S., it happens throughout Latin America. We have very similar histories. All those countries have very similar histories around displacing indigenous communities and enslaving African people. And so I think there's right now an unpacking and a knowledge of that has happened across the Americas. And I think the more people are learning, the more we're able to have the conversation in our community of how that oppression happens within our community. And I think Latinidad makes it like when we say we're all one, we're all together, let's all fight for each other. And that's beautiful. Yes, let's all fight for each other. But when you're using that to erase someone's experience of oppression, now we're not a community and now we're not fighting for each other, And I think that term is sometimes used in that way. And I can understand why folks who have experienced that oppression in our community would not want to identify with that term because it erases who they are and their experience of what they've experienced in our community. And so I think that's why it's a complicated term and why it's one that I'm not sure that I completely relate to. I go back and forth in using it. But yeah, that's ultimately what I understand it
as. Paula, I want to kind of hone in on something that Linda just said a moment ago, and then something she said a little earlier. There seems to be a bit of tension between the quest for unification, or at least the recognition that unification needs to happen and be present in the Latino community, but also wanting to keep the nuance of who everyone is within this community. Do you think it is possible to do both?
Yeah, of course. I think Linda already explain what Latinidad is, and I think in that explanation is sort of the answer to this question. Like what we're all questioning right now is exactly this thing. Is there such a thing as one voice? And I think Latinidad tells us like no. For so many years, the story of Latinidad, the story of what it meant to be a Latina in this country, revolved around this idea that, or really pushed the older generations to believe that in order to achieve the American dream, our parents or the older generation of Latinos had to get as aligned as possible to whiteness, had to sort of put their head down, assimilate, and sort of conform to this idea that the U.S. government and history has told us of what Latinos looked like, and how they spoke in this country. And I think what's happening in this moment is that all of that is suddenly being questioned. No, but I think you can still believe in both. You can still believe that we have a huge force in our numbers. No, we're over 65 million Latinos, and we've become the largest minority voting bloc. We're the youngest demographic in this country. That is a huge amount of political force. But at the same time, we now need to do something that we haven't done before, which is understand the different ways that we have all developed. No, understand what it means to be Afro-Latino in this country, right? What it means to not just be criminalized by the immigration system, but also by the criminal justice system. No, what it means to suddenly identify as queer Latino, right? What it means to want to, again, live as an immigrant, live as a Latino, but also as queer. And so I think that's exactly the moment that we're in. And that's why we're having these conversations. And it is extremely confusing because we've never been able to dig into that. And so 100%. I think that is the moment that we're in, and the only way to truly progress and to do it right. No, the only way to at least attempt to understand what it is that unifies us is paying attention to these different segments that are telling us, wait a second. No, for so many years, I have been erased from the conversation. There's no better story to understand that than from the story of what it means to be Black Latino in this country, a segment that has been completely erased. No, there's barely any data in this moment. And so we're in that moment. I think the only way to move forward as storytellers, as policymakers, as folks in media, is by paying attention to those segments. So yes, I hope so.
Paula, you brought up the LGBTQ community. Right now, per the statistics, 1 in 5 Latinos identify as being LGBTQ. Looking at this from a generational standpoint, Paula, do you think that Gen Z and maybe the generations that come after it are more poised to kind of lean into this part of their identity in a way that those before, grandparents, parents, couldn't?
100%. I mean, sort of to go back to my previous answer, I think that's what we're seeing. No, for so long that this idea of what it meant to be American was defined by someone else. No, and it makes sense. So our parents and folks that migrated here before had to assimilate to that idea. The beauty of the moment that we're in right now is that the younger generation of Latinos, we get to define what it means to be American. No, because we have a lot more privilege. No, whether it's through papers or not, we have developed voices in a way that our parents couldn't. And that's sort of evident in the numbers. As you said, it's incredible. Among the millennial generation, Latinos are the most likely to identify as queer. You look at the US Census, and suddenly the amount of Latinos that now identify with more than one race was huge compared to in 2010. Now, over 45 million Latinos right now identify with more than one race. Bad Bunny, you can like him or not, but he is someone that is sort of questioning gender norms in a platform. In the most stereotypical Latino platforms in Spanish language media, he is out there. He at least gets to push these stereotypes. And you look outside the windows, and the biggest and most sort of impressive activists that we have are trans Latinas. No, the most impressive activists we have are undocumented folks, dreamers, because unlike their parents, they are deciding to step outside of the shadows. Now, those are generational shifts. So 100%, I think what we're seeing now is this freedom to lean into this diversity that for so long, we've been told that we couldn't do that.
I guess to further quote some statistics is there's also 1/4 of U.S. Latinos who self-identify as Afro-Latino. And, this is something that certainly among friends I have that are Afro-Latino that we have talked about is that there is this push, given especially the country that we're in, to identify as one or the other. Linda, do you still feel like that this is pretty prevalent, that Afro-Latinos feel like that they have to choose which one to identify with?
I don't, I won't speak for them, but I feel like I resonate with that. The whole census thing is a conversation that I feel, I just was reading so much folks were talking about it, and just the having to look at that census and decide what you're gonna fill, knowing your ancestry or not knowing your ancestry, because of the historical parts, the historical things that have led to you not really knowing where you kind of come from. So I think it's a complicated thing for so many of us, and the census has tried to box us in so many ways for so many years. I think it was Hispanic was one of them, and it was either Hispanic, white, Black, and I think Asian was the other one. And yeah, I mean, I think if it's anything like my experience, I think trying to figure out which one you check and which one you feels most close to who you are as a person, I think is complicated and difficult, and also I think ultimately doesn't fully reflect or represent who we are in this country. And someone recently had said, like a predominant this young dreamer activist online, a predominant amount of the folks from Mexico have a lot of indigenous blood DNA, but are not considered indigenous because they don't know. That the detribalization of so many of our communities over hundreds of years has led to not really knowing where you're from, and so you don't know what to check off. And so then ultimately, the United States shows like something like a 3% Native American population when the reality is different, because the census isn't really depicting what, or giving us the opportunity to make the choice that makes the most sense for us. And ultimately, I don't even know that we know to identify with it, again, because of that history of being told not to identify with it, seeing it as something negative or bad. So yeah, I think it's a complicated thing that ultimately probably affects all of our communities, all the different factions of our community, and like it's not a good representation of our needs overall as a community, right? Because if you see in the census one thing and you're saying like, oh, it's all good, let's do XYZ, but the reality is different. We actually have a bigger coalition of people who need that representation, whatever it may be. Like, then we're not doing the work. We're not getting the representation we need. We're not doing the legwork to cover the folks who need that support.
Linda, you brought up earlier in this conversation how important representation is. You co-created the hit show on Netflix, Gentrified. How would you say, or what role would you say Hollywood has played in shaping the perception of the Latino community?
Oh, I think a big role. I think that it's really, we've been erased from the narrative. It's funny, recently America Ferrera, who's one of our executive producers, said in an interview, not being represented in the media is like walking into your house and not having any photos of yourself up on the walls. Like, every photo is of other people except for you, and how that feels and how impactful it is to not be represented. And I think that for many years, for many generations, we haven't seen our experiences and our varied experiences really told to the extent that we needed to be told. With Gentrified, it's been a beautiful but also somewhat bittersweet experience to receive so many comments and DMs and tweets from people saying that they feel seen for the first time. And this is not the first show, right, that's Latino, but again, going back to this idea of the varied experiences that we had, this is the first show that they saw their own experience, that they saw their own family, that they saw their own face. And considering that the Mexican American population in the United States is as big as it is, that's very tragic when you really think about it. It's beautiful. I love that I get to have that opportunity to bring that perspective to media, but it's tragic that in 2021 or 2020, when the show came out, some folks are barely seeing themselves for the first time, or able to, or their parents. I have so many folks who have said that have sat down with their fathers and their mothers, and they're like glued to the television and watching from start to finish, because their experience as immigrants to this country, living in this country with their children and their grandchildren, that has not been depicted. Like, so many of our stories are about that border crossing and the trauma porn of that border crossing, or we're relegated to the help. We're the nannies, the maids, the gardeners, the cholos, the criminals, all of which exist in our community, but who also don't get three-dimensional representations of themselves. We don't get to see the maid that I know, which were my aunts growing up, who were full three-dimensional women who did not put up with shit and would just, do their thing. We don't get to see that representation in media. And I think that, the work is big. There's a lot left to do, even despite a show like my own and others, because even for us, like we're asked to represent so many communities. Folks are like, what about us? What about us? And I think that's a symptom again of like, there needs to be more. It can't be a few creators with a few shows. It needs to be multiple, and it needs to be more of us behind the camera. We need to have more Afro-Latino creators creating content, more Indigenous Latinx creators creating content. We need to have a bigger swell. And I think we're working on it, like Bella said, again, going back to this idea of the Latinx identity. I think that's the unification that we're trying to do. We're doing it for that reason. We're trying to unify because in the numbers, we're going to be able to make some moves in the industry without each other, without each other to hold the people in power accountable. It's much more difficult. And more of us who get behind the camera in positions of power, like my own as a creator and a showrunner, the better, because in my experience, like, if there's not someone like me sitting on the other side advocating for a Latinx director or Afro-Latino photographer or whatever it may be, then who's going to be doing it? Like, we need us behind the camera in positions of power to do that.
We have about a minute left. It really flew by very fast. I want to close out with asking both of you a question. When you think about the totality of the Latino community right now, how does society's view of being a Latino differ from how you actually feel or what you feel it means to be a Latino today? Paula, I'll start with you.
Well, just since we're talking about perceptions, right? One of the things that came out just 2 weeks, maybe like a month ago, was that many Americans, when they think about Latinos, they believe that over 30% of Latinos are undocumented, right? Whereas just 13% of Latinos are undocumented. There's a massive gap. First of all, there's a lot of pride in being undocumented, so that's not where I'm going. But there's a massive gap about what the Americans think about when they view us, no? There's, as Linda said, there's a lot of like sensationalizing the border. There's a lot of sensationalizing these issues, and there's still very much think of us as a stereotype. I think this conversation said it perfectly. You know, we are extremely diverse, and there's incredible voices. There are powerful voices, and I think the most important thing that we have as a community is these really, really, really unique stories. You know? And I think one of the biggest barriers we have as a community is that sometimes we feel like we can't tell those stories. So that's why I love Gentified, because it is finally we're seeing us in the screens, and I think that's the beginning of massive change. So the perception is very different from the reality, and the reality is that we're very different, we're powerful, and that the amount of power that is in our voices, I think, has the potential to really continue changing what this country looks like, strives for, and at least reining us back into what this country was supposed to be all about, no? Which is that freedom that many of our families came here for.
Linda?
Oh, I mean, yeah, I agree with Paula. Like, I think there's just, I'm so sorry. Can you repeat the question for me?
Oh, yeah, sure. When you think about how society views the Latino community, just sort of marry that versus how you feel or what you feel it means to be a Latino today.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I've had a lot of thoughts around the way, sort of what Paula said, the way that we are still seen as foreign, even though I was born and raised here. My parents have been here for 40 plus years. And we, in our content and anything that we do, is often still infused or looked at with shame. And it's a very subconscious thing, I think. It's a very subconscious bias that comes about. This foreignness, this shame around being foreign, I think, is something that permeates every part of our communities. And whether you're Afro-Latino, Indigenous, like mixed, whatever you may be, I think there's this shame around our foreignness that I think is affecting so many parts of our identity. And like Paula said, a big part of creating Gentified for me was showing like our lives here in this country, to really show like, no, we are a part of this country. We are here. We've been here. We've been experiencing this world where we listen to Vicente Fernandez, and we also listen to No Doubt and Bad Bunny, and we have all the different layers of ourselves, and they exist in this country. And I think people don't see, sometimes they see us and they see us as foreign. And there's something about that narrative that I think is causing problems in terms of people understanding who we are. And I think for me, being able to infuse that into a creative, series like Gentified, be able to infuse that identity and represent it in its fullness is for me really claiming I'm an American. Like, this is where I grew up. This is who I am. This is what I identify as. I have Mexican culture as well, and this mix is actually an American thing. And for folks to understand that we are not foreign, we are a part of this country. And I think the more that we are able to unpack that shame and that rejection of us, the easier it's going to get for us to be included into the narrative of this country, because we've been here for generations. Some of us are native to these lands, so yeah, that's how I feel about it.
Well, I want to thank you both, and let me apologize to you, Linda, because I guess my gringo brain locked in and I pronounced it gentified instead of hentified. So my
don't worry,
apologies
my
for
dad
that.
pronounces it gentified, and he's
I was
completely
like,
fluent in Spanish. I'm like, "Apá, it's gentified." He's like, "Oh, okay." So don't worry,
yeah.
you're good.
Yes, and it's even more embarrassing because my minor in college was Spanish. So, like, I really do feel like calling to apologize to all of my Spanish teachers right now and saying I'm sorry. And I'm sure Bad Bunny thanks you both for all the publicity that you gave him during this time. uh, anyway, I
He's
want to
doing
thank both of
okay.
you. Yeah, I think he's doing all right. Those checks are definitely cashing. I want to thank you both for joining us and for participating in what was a wonderful, nuanced conversation. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you two ladies for sharing your perspective.
Thank you for having
Thank you
us.
so much.
So wonderful.
Next, a conversation about the connection between college and upward mobility. Please welcome Deborah Santiago, CEO of Excelencia in Education, and Chris Soto, a special advisor to the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Education. The Atlantic senior editor, Matthew Rodriguez, is here to lead the conversation.
Deborah and Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's jump right in. Latino students were once the fastest growing group of college undergraduates, but recent statistics show that since the pandemic, enrollment is down among this group and across the board. Today, Latinos are twice as likely to forego college plans in favor of working, a movement spurred by the condition of the labor market, familial organization obligations, and recent wage increases. Experts worry that if the trend continues, it could erode years of gains in these communities. And so based off this, I have a couple of questions, and I want to start with Chris. Despite the pre-pandemic surge in enrollment, only 19% of Latinos have at least a bachelor's degree compared to kind of 1 in 3 overall. So what do you consider the biggest obstacles keeping more Latinos from pursuing college degrees, and what role can the government play in helping to close that gap?
Yeah, it's a great question, and thanks for having us today. As we get straight to the issue, I think we have to look at affordability for colleges. We've seen the price of college increase dramatically over the years, and we know what the stats are for earnings for young people as they get a post-secondary credential, whether that's a credential or an actual degree. So we know what it does to break the cycle of poverty. Having run a small organization doing college completion work, I know what that impact is for families and how they can break that cycle of poverty. But I think we have to look at affordability. This is exactly why we as an administration have been looking at and working towards increasing the Pell Grant amount, also allowing DACA recipients to get access to Pell funds in the most recent proposal. So these are some of the short-term things that we're doing, but absolutely, I would say affordability is at the crux of it.
Mm. Deborah, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, thanks. I think in addition to what Chris shared, what we've seen is the opportunities in our K-12 system to make sure we're academically prepared, have access to the kind of quality education we need so we can access higher education is core. And then also looking at institutions that need to think differently about how to meet students where they're at, as opposed to just looking at students to be college ready, to make sure that the strengths we bring to a college education and the potential we have is the focus of effort rather than all the areas that are seen as deficits about our community, which I don't think are really even accurate.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Deborah. My next question is going to be directed towards you, but obviously, Chris, you can jump in as well. Deborah, many Latino students live at home and also partly support their families even while they're attending college. What effect do you think that the pandemic specifically has had on the kind of multi-generational home and the progress that Latino college students have made? And a kind of follow-up to that as well is, do you think there are any indicators that Latino student enrollment might bounce back to pre-pandemic levels as we're heading into a new school year, 22-23?
Yeah, thanks. We saw Latinos were the primary growth population in higher education over the last 10 years. And in a year and a half of this pandemic, we lost about 5 years of enrollment growth. and that's access to higher education. So I do think that that's an area of focus and attention. It means we have to be much more intentional in making sure our community gets included, and that means institutions have to find ways to make sure include us, addressing a lot of the affordability issues that Chris mentioned. The reality is our community was disproportionately negatively impacted by the pandemic. We're the frontline workers. Our parents are the ones that are making sure in the service industry and others, and that impact ripples. And the college age population, which is so tightly committed to our family and supporting, has stepped in, and our belief in faith and family is critical. And the support network that family provides is one of strength. And I think we need to focus on that element. And when you have multi-generational households, thinking about what does it mean when you might be out there working and coming back, when you have grandparents and others living with you, means it's very real. And there is a pragmatism involved in what institutions of higher education, what public policy can do to make sure that our community is included and that there is policy that kind of leverages the strength we bring as individuals and family in a way that doesn't just ask us to fit a traditional mold and pathway to college, but rather that can address this kind of post-traditional student population, which really represents the majority of students, not just Latinos. Mm-hmm. We are kind of the representative, the harbingers of that representation. I do think the last question was about, do we see progress going forward? The challenge we see is community colleges have not quite bounced back in the same way as four-year institutions in terms of Latino enrollment, and the opportunity to look at what are ways that our community colleges can make sure that students who are having to make real pragmatic choices between employment and enrollment can go to college. I think that's the opportunity if we're going to see back to the growth that we had seen prior to the pandemic.
That's so interesting what you were talking about. I love that you used the word harbingers, and that actually kind of segues, I think, really nicely into our next question, which is that, right now, Latino students kind of comprise about 20% or 1/5 of college students nationwide. And that's, a really large chunk of the American student population. And that's something that the Biden administration has really recognized, an executive order that the administration issued in September. It put the full weight of its support behind Hispanic serving institutions. And I was wondering, Chris, if you could maybe explain, what are some of the administration's key initiatives that are targeted at Latino students and how Hispanic serving institutions play a role?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the first thing is that we obviously recognize the strength that HSIs, Hispanic serving institutions, kind of bring to the fabric of our communities, right? They're building and developing the leaders that are coming back and serving and working in our communities. And this, I think, goes back to, I think, what Deborah said, which was a great point about meeting students where they're at, and kind of the need for colleges to be nimble. We talked about community colleges, or we're talking about community colleges, and then kind of university systems in general. I think, community colleges have that opportunity to be more nimble, and that allows them to meet students where they're at, right? The last time that America added years for free schooling was at the turn of the century. So this is why we've been focused on free community college. But again, the community colleges have that opportunity to be nimble, meet students where they're at. I can give you an example. We were just in South Texas, visiting a Hispanic serving institution out there where they're partnering with high schools, so that way those students can get college credentials while they're in high schools. We were in Chicago, Arturo Velázquez Institute, where this college is responding directly to the needs that are in that community. They're letting community needs drive the offerings of schools. So these are kind of examples of how community college specifically can be nimble. And to the point about bouncing back, I think that we have a unique opportunity right now with a once in a generation opportunity for federal funds, and that that required us as an agency to look at how we provide more flexibility for these funds. Now, a lot of these funds were used directly for student relief, and rightly so. But it was also an opportunity to use some of those funds to innovate, right? The pandemic, really challenged institutions to look at doing business differently. And so we've got funds for students offering relief, but then also thinking about how we reimagine education, reimagine what post-secondary education looks like for students, so that way we can really meet the students where they're at.
I just want to take a moment to remind everyone that's watching that they can participate in the conversation via the Q&A tab if they have any questions, and we're going to try and get to them before the end of this session. And, Chris, just now you were kind of talking about ways that the administration is kind of working top down, like working with Hispanic serving institutions. And I really quickly want to kind of change gears or maybe just go to the opposite side of that and talk about, something that that was a big, topic of discussion during the election was student loan forgiveness. And the Biden administration, previously had promised $10,000 in student loan forgiveness per borrower, but obviously with all of the priorities of the administration, progress has stalled. Can you provide an update on how the administration is planning to address student loan forgiveness?
Yes, absolutely. And I know it's a topic on everybody's mind. And what I can say is that to date, we've targeted relief to over 600,000 students, over 12 billion directly to those needing relief. That's a direct result of improvements to the systems that we've done to automate programs and also deliver relief to students who are misled by institutions. This is an ongoing conversation that we're having with the White House, we're having with the Department of Justice. And look, I know, I'm sitting here understanding very clearly that there's frustrations out there, but we're going to continue working on this with the White House, and we're committed to seeing what we can do administratively.
Deborah, I would love for you to weigh in as well. How do you think that a measure like student loan forgiveness might impact Latino students specifically?
Latinos are more loan averse than the average student who goes to college. Often we make choices to go part-time, stop out, go to more less selective institutions in order to be able to afford going to college. So I think loan forgiveness is important. I think it's a little bit less of a policy priority for many of our Latino students, unless we're talking about loan forgiveness for students who take out loans and don't complete, where we see a disproportionate representation of Latino students there. Their loan amounts tend to be lower, but still important. It can be a disincentive for others in the community, for siblings and others to either go back or to go in the first place. So I think that paying attention to when you bring a Latino lens to the policy, how does it resonate and fit with our community? I think in the same way as you talked to about HSIs, and Chris made really good points about making sure these are institutions, they represent less than 20% of institutions in the country, but they enroll over 65% of all Latino undergraduates. And for us, the focus is, how do you know that they're intentionally serving, not just enrolling our students? Because the definition is predicated on enrollment. And I think our point is, we want them not just to enroll, but we want them to graduate. And the institutional role there is key. So I think both loan forgiveness, how we invest in HSIs, and how we hold them a little bit accountable for not just enrolling, but meeting the goal students have to graduate.
Deborah, I want to follow up because you actually brought up a statistic that was kind of almost in line with a question that I had, which was not specifically about HSIs, but we're looking at like institutions that serve Latinos. We have to talk about community colleges because those are kind of the number one point of entry into college, whether they stay in the community college or they transfer out. Over 60% of Latinos kind of start with community college. So can you talk about like specifically the advantages for Latino students of attending a community college versus a four-year institution?
Sure. So the reality is that they are accessible, and that's not insignificant, right? We talk a lot about, for example, HSIs, whether it's created because of demography and geography or intentionality and impact. Community colleges are in communities and areas where Latinos live. And when we talk to Latino students, they tell us they often make college choices in ways that are seen as unconventional, right? I think convention is you make college choices based on financial aid, academic programs, and prestige. But for many Latino students, they make choices based on access, location, and cost. And thinking about that, means community colleges are an affordable option. They can often balance their family, their work responsibilities, and the academic education they strive for. I think the challenge is making sure that they can balance all of those in a way that gets them an education. And if they want a baccalaureate degree, that they can advance in that space as well. Community colleges provide lots of opportunities, and I think that's their strength in the community. And they have the ability to be flexible and pivot in a way that I think Chris mentioned allows for them to meet students where they're at. All of those are strengths and the value of community colleges for our community.
I love so much of what you were just talking about, Deborah. And I think at the heart of it was really this idea of like equity. And I wanted to ask you, Chris, that really segues nicely to the next question, is that I think equity has been a priority for this administration. And I wanted to know, like, if you could give us a snapshot of what are some other federal programs and partnerships that are being developed to help Latino students specifically.
Yeah, well, before getting to kind of the equity question, I did want to add on to what Deborah said as we think about kind of community colleges being that entry point. There's this element, and we talked about kind of finances and what that looks like for students, and we have to ask if they're going down the community college path because they want to, or because they're making certain financial choices that require them to go to a community college, right? Because it's an affordable option. And what do I mean? I mean, basically, when we look at the data, we know that Latinos as a subgroup receive the lowest financial aid offers or financial aid packages compared to other students. So, I think it's a question worth examining as we move this work forward, because again, I think, Deborah brought up some great points about why community colleges are such great opportunities for students. But then when we think about students who are looking to pursue a 4-year degree, who maybe make the choice to go to community college because of some limiting factors, I think we need to tackle some of those issues around affordability and look at, why students are receiving those financial aid packages that as subgroups are lower than others. As far as specific things that we're doing, again, two things that are at top of mind for us is increasing that Pell Grant amount and also providing access to the Pell Grant for DACA recipients. These will be game changers for students in our communities. We know that we've seen that. We know that sometimes a student's account can be on hold for $1 or for $1,000, and so that increase in the Pell Grant, allowing them not only to afford the classes, but some of those other incidental expenses that require immediate attention, whether that's transportation, whether that's childcare. So we definitely see those two elements as game changers. And then the last piece is, again, around the flexibility. Again, this once in a generation opportunity with higher education relief funds. This is over $14 billion that's been put out there to institutions. And we try to make it as flexible as possible because we know we're in a dynamic situation right now. Things are constantly evolving, and institutions need a lot of flexibility with those funds, again, not only to respond to immediate needs, but then again, innovate. How can we reimagine education for students?
Thank you so much for that thoughtful answer. And, we have some audience questions and they're really, really great. And I just want to make sure that we have time to get to them. So the first one that we have here is a really great question, which is from Milana, which is, how might we create stronger and more accessible pathways for Latinos to enter medical school so that we have a physician population that better reflects our actual population?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to jump in first. Yeah, absolutely. So, I think we have to break down the silos. I've been doing a lot of work in communities where higher education is clearly focused on their work, K-12 is clearly focused on their work, and until we break down those silos and aligning these systems so that way they're seamless pathways, we're not going to get there. And so we've been really challenging and pushing partners and colleagues, elevating examples of excellence where those pathways are happening. A pathway shouldn't start in 12th grade. We're talking about, very, very much earlier than that. So that way students can see themselves in the careers that they want to aspire to. So again, I don't want to needs of the. I think the key takeaway here is about creating realistic pathways that start earlier than 12th grade. So that way students can really see themselves in those careers and be prepared for those careers.
I could just add to that because I agree with Chris. I think the other opportunity is to, we have to be overt about the role models. 40% of Latino students who enroll in college are the first in their family to go. They don't know what those pathways are. So one is to align the system and the structure. The other is to make sure students know what the pathway can be and what the potential is. And that means having role models that can shine the light and shine the way for them. And that means we have to be accurate in the profile of understanding who our community is and what the opportunities are for us. And I often find that that's a challenge for folks that want to assume an inaccurate profile of who we are and who we can be. And if you've not seen a Latino doctor before, do you know that that's for you and there's a potential in what's involved? And so I do think there's investing in a pathway, articulating the pathway, and leading those through the pathway with role models and others. All of those are doable. We have to show a commitment to will to make sure that happens.
If I could just jump in on that, Deborah, thank you so much for kind of talking about, you can't be what you can't see. And in my previous role, we had students who were looking to access higher education, and they by and large said they wanted to be two things. They wanted to be nurses or they wanted to own their own business. And when you dig into that, right, and you dissect that a little bit, nurses, professional careers that they're used to being around or maybe have the most exposure to. And, they want to own their own business, not knowing what that means, but they know that they want to kind of lift themselves and lift their families out of poverty. So I couldn't agree more about, having those examples, having those role models, so that way they know what else is out there.
That's all the time that we have for today. And I just wanted to thank you, Deborah and Chris, for giving such thoughtful, really illuminating answers. This is something that's, I think, really important and really near and dear to my own heart. I have a young niece and nephew that are young, but I can already see them blossoming, and I want them to have all the opportunities that their, counterparts have. And so this is such an important conversation. And so I just want to thank you so much for being so thoughtful and present with us today. So thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
And now for a discussion produced by our underwriter, the MacArthur Foundation.
On the state of the Latino community. My name is Bria Gillum, Senior Program Officer with the MacArthur Foundation and part of the Criminal Justice Program. The Safety and Justice Challenge is the MacArthur Foundation's criminal justice initiative, which is focused on providing solutions to address mass incarceration in our local jails and eliminate racial and ethnic disparities. We are investing in over 50 local communities across the U.S. and supporting local solutions to better understand why this country continues to admit over 11 million people per year in our jails, the majority of whom are presumed innocent. Our local jails are also places that are overcrowded, and they tend to house people who are poor, lack housing, who suffer from mental health, addiction, or both. And across this country, our local jails are places that disproportionately incarcerate Black, Latino, and Indigenous people. I'm excited to be joined in conversation today with Juleka Lantigua Williams, who is a grantee of the Safety and Justice Challenge, and among other things, is the creator and producer of 70 Million, a podcast that's investing how local communities are addressing the role of jails. By using the voices of our big cities to our rural and Indigenous communities, this storytelling is taking a closer look at communities and programs that are trying bold solutions to solve big problems in criminal justice. So Juleka, welcome.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. So let's dive in. The title of this session is really trying to understand why criminal justice is a Latino issue. So can you talk about why Latinos should care about criminal justice and how we can make sure that it is part of the forefront of a lot of the reform efforts that we're seeing going on across this country right now?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. You know how passionate I am about criminal justice and reform and getting information out. And so every chance that I have to talk about it is really a gift. And so first and foremost, there's the math. And the math says Latinos are going to be the largest ethnic population in the United States. We are already outpacing population growth in every other major ethnic group in the United States. And so we are the next Americans. And so criminal justice reform is an American issue. So Latinos have to embrace that as part of their American identities, as part of their responsibility as citizens. So that's one, right? Just the math. The simple math is that this is our issue because we are Americans. But the second part of that is that there is very much a matrix between immigration and criminal justice. And it is not an exaggeration to say that private and public criminal justice enterprises, local jails, county jails, private prisons, private prison corporations, they are replacing the quote unquote traditional prison and jail populations with immigrants. So ICE for the last 3 years has been quite literally renting beds to hold people who are in their custody. And, you know, unfortunately, immigration is largely seen as a Latino issue, although it is not, right? Immigration impacts so many more people than just Latinos, but we just happen to be the largest representative group within that issue, within immigration. And so that's the second reason that that criminal justice reform is and has to be understood as a Latino issue, in that Latinos who are coming in from Central America, people who are seeking refuge, people who are running away from war-torn countries are now being put into the existing matrix of criminal justice administration. And so we have to care about that. There was that horrible example in the Southwest of Latina women being subjected to sterilization procedures. Right? I mean, if that didn't bring home the message, I don't know what could possibly bring home the message.
You know, we've talked a lot about today this theme that Latinos are not a homogenous group. We've heard a lot about how do you talk about the community, how do you talk about different identities. But I'm also curious, you know, when we're talking about Latinos, there are extreme differences between older and younger Latinos, as well as class issues. So can you talk about the impact of both those factors, especially when we're talking about criminal justice reform?
Absolutely. And so one of the key things that we're learning as we move into, you know, for example, the Gen Z generation, right, where there's 70 million of them, right, and the millennial generation, where there's another however many millions and millions of them there are, right? So we're starting to see that there are a lot of important differences within the Latinos. And so one of them is that the second, third, fourth, fifth generation Latino is growing up in a far more inclusive and representative environment than their immigrant parents ever experienced. So, you know, typically immigrant parents who came as late as the 90s, right, came into what were considered immigrant enclaves, right? An aunt came some years ago, then they followed, and other cousins followed, and that's typically how it went. But then as we are reaching college level educations and as we're moving into managerial positions, we're now moving out of these enclaves and moving into more middle class communities, moving into more urban, upwardly mobile communities. And so we're now, and our children are now being exposed to a whole host of other types of Americans who also have hyphenated identities. And so there is less of a racial and ethnic differentiation when it comes to our politics and more based on simple factors about justice, so that millennials, Gen Zs, and now alphas, which is my children's generation, they see one another, right? And they embrace their differences and they acknowledge and celebrate those differences. But where they find commonalities, things that they care about. So they care about the environment, right? Very, very big issue with the Gen Zs and the alphas. They care very much about the environment. They also care very much about inclusion and simple justice, just everyone getting a chance right? Not everyone has to win. I think it's something that for immigrants, and I'm an immigrant myself, we were so ingrained with the notion of this American dream where it was a zero sum. Either you achieved it or you didn't achieve it. Well, that's not the case anymore. And so things like voting access, things like women's rights, things like criminal justice reform, these are all part of the sense of simple justice, of everyone should have the opportunity to have a chance to thrive, a chance to succeed, a chance to have dignified work. And so these are more of the values that the second, third, fourth generation of Latinos are growing up with, and that they are finding common ground with their peers and their friends and their mates and their husbands who come from all types of backgrounds.
Well, Jalika, this session went way too fast. I really appreciate your insight into this conversation, talking about the diversity of the community, the importance of our youth, and sort of the hopefulness that I think is going to be coming forward, if not already, in this moment that we're in. So a huge thank you and appreciation for your joining us in conversation today.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Up next, a conversation about Latinos and law enforcement. Please welcome Maria Teresa Kumar, President and CEO of Voto Latino, and Carmen Perez, President and CEO of the Gathering for Justice. Here to lead the conversation is Atlantic Assistant Editor Christian Paz.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you, Carmen and Maria Teresa, for being here. I want to dive right into our conversation about justice, the law, and law enforcement. Latino officers have been the driving force in the diversification of police departments for more than 2 decades now, but few rise to the very tops of those organizations. So, Carmen, I have this question for you. Does having more Black and Brown officers in law enforcement help communities of color? And what's being done to amplify their voices once they get there?
Hi, well, thank you so much for having me. And I'm really excited to be having this conversation. Being in the field of criminal justice for the past 25 years, it's, not necessarily something that we've actually seen get better when it comes to having Latinos be part of law enforcement or corrections, especially because their voice isn't necessarily being elevated. They're not necessarily individuals that rank to the top. They're trying to navigate a system that also oppresses our people. And so oftentimes people who go in who are either being recruited in because there's no resources in our communities to have a different path, or because they feel they can make a difference, are not being elevated to positions where they can actually make a difference. There are some cases like people like Mark Varela out of Ventura County who's doing transformational work, but that's not the case in other departments, especially because, as a conversation was stated before, criminal justice is not seen as a Latino issue. Although I've been in this field for 27 years, or people like Nane Alejandres has been in this field for 40 years, this is really the first time that we're having this conversation on this scale. And so it's important for us to understand that we're still making progress on an issue that has not necessarily been a topic of conversation at our dinner tables.
Yeah, you get to this question that I wanted to follow up with, which is, is representation enough? We focus so much on the importance of elevating people, Latinos, Black and Brown folk, to positions of power, but what can they actually do once they get into those positions?
Is that for me, Christian?
I was actually Carmen. Carmen, would you mind weighing in on that? Yeah.
Hi, Carmen. Great to see you. How are you?
Hi. So I think, it's important to understand that when we get in these positions, it's sometimes hard to navigate the space, especially when there's so few of us. But what we can do is that we can actually support leaders that are in this field. Like it was stated earlier, Latinos are not a monolith, right? And so we have to create coalitions. We have to create spaces where we're coming together, we're strategizing, we're looking at the data that's also misrepresented, right? Because there's not enough data. There are major data gaps when it comes to Latinos in these fields. But I think there are opportunities for us to come together from all different paths, not just people who are at the leadership of law enforcement, but also people who are working on policy, who are working in the social justice movement, and have conversations about how we could also reduce the numbers of Latinos that are incarcerated or in these spaces, whether they're being deported, incarcerated, or killed at the hands of police.
Definitely. And I want to get back to that point later in our conversation. Maria Teresa, I wanted to turn to you. Surprisingly, there's research from the University of Buffalo and Washington University in St. Louis that finds that Latino men were over 2.6 times as likely as others to be killed by officers from agencies with relatively higher percentages of Latino police officers. And I'm wondering, what can we attribute to this? You would expect this to not be the case.
So first of all, thank you for this conversation. And I think as Carmen had pointed out, and the person before, the conversation before that was led by MacArthur pointed out, is that Latinos are very much part of the criminal justice system, but we're never acknowledged. And I can share with you that part of it is cultural. Part of it is you have families that you have, and this is the experience for me. And Carmen, I think you and I have discussed this. I mean, one of the reasons that I got into the work of Voto Latino was that I can see that the men in my family were tracked very differently than the women in my family. I grew up in Sonoma, California. Sonoma, California, by every stretch of the imagination, should be one of the most liberal bastions of America. And in fact, by the time 7 of my male cousins had been 16 years old, all of them had been pulled over by a police officer and racially profiled. That is not coincidental. It had everything for them being driving while brown. What Carmen alluded to, though, is important because when you look at the data, none of us would ever know this because most officers and most police departments to this day still only check off the box based on how you present yourself. Are you Black or are you white? And there's everything in between. And so one of the biggest issues that we have is that unless you are correcting for data and you actually understand the people you're serving, and unless you actually understand the population that is getting incarcerated and the police officers on the other side, you cannot solve a public policy issue. And so one of the things that Voto Latino did is we worked very closely with then President Obama's 21st century police force. And the idea is like, how do you transform the police department for the 21st century? And we worked very closely with our audience trying to figure out what are those recommendations. And not surprisingly, when we had to testify, what I testified was based on recommendations from over 500 individuals from the Latino community providing us with solutions. One was, how do you actually have this conversation where you decouple ICE from law enforcement? That was huge. So for example, imagine being a Latino law enforcement officer and you're knocking on these doors and then you ask for someone's for immigration status. That doesn't build trust. So you're not going to have someone calling the police department for domestic abuse or any other thing. And so one of the things that we really have to look at is if we are trying to achieve this idea of a modernized criminal justice reform that really speaks to a population across America, regardless of color, then we have to make sure that we are collecting the correct data so we can actually start solving for that. That's one. And the other is, how do we actually start creating wraparound services so that the first phone call that is received for a mental health crisis is not a police officer, but perhaps someone else from a community, as we're starting to see work quite well in Colorado.
I also like to. I also want to add is it's also important to note that just because Latinos are overrepresented in a population of jails and prisons, it does not mean we commit more crimes, right? Exactly. Especially what Maria Teresa just alluded to. Latinos are overwhelmingly facing discrimination in the justice system. Our communities are over surveillanced and over policed. From the presence of police in schools called resource officers to being randomly stopped, like she mentioned, in the street because of racial bias under policies like stop and frisk. Latinx people come into contact with police way more often than our white counterparts. This is because of the history of racism and the formation of police to oppress and control Latinx and Black people in the U.S., as well as to protect white property. And so when we think about why people, the officers having a significant more number of officers in departments, how come we're not seeing a decrease in maybe police shootings? But it's because they don't have the flexibility to actually undo some of the racial some of the racist policies that led to the creation of those departments.
Got it. I actually have an audience question that relates to this that I wanted to offer to both of you. So it says, having a diverse police force isn't a solution to justice and better policing. We need to address policy, training, culture, and structures that support the system that happens outside the system through other accountable governmental structures. Can you talk a little bit about what that would look like? What are some of these governmental structures that can hold police forces accountable, et cetera, and what kind of work do they need to be doing?
So I can talk a little bit about the part.
Sorry.
Yeah, yeah, so I can talk a little bit about the first part just because, so one of the recommendations that came out of President Obama's 21st Century Task Force was exactly this. How do we actually create community groups and partnerships that with law enforcement so that it is not just law enforcement monitoring the community, but also bringing in much more mental health providers, making sure that we're talking about bringing in culture and the arts. And it was and they had set up pilot programs around the country to do this, and they were going to use them as models, ideally, to basically go around the country to do it. And one of the things that we found during the policing task force was that the more collaboration, the more interaction between police officers and the community, we saw incidences of arrests and incidences of hostility go down, principally because a lot of the police officers coming into community were not from the community. They were mostly from very rural areas. And you can imagine the impact that media has when, if you are a white officer and you go into downtown, urban area X, and your only understanding of a Latino or Black community is what you see on Law and Order. And this is real. Like, these were real sentiments that were uncovered. To make a long story short, they were making a lot of these police departments were making gains in the community. The community was starting to feel like they knew each other at some level. And then sadly, Trump came in, and one of the first things that he cut was the gutting of these programs. And so now it's a matter of, where are they? I know that the Department of Justice is looking into how to rebuild them, but you can imagine that having a program where you're trying to build trust, immediately taken away from the community, and then going back and saying, so sorry, we're going to try this again, that is also a moment of healing. And I think it is to the detriment, because there are policies and people on the government level that were trying to make those changes, not as fast as needs to happen, but they were in those beginning points. And I think that is part of the challenge now, is like, how do you rebuild back that, especially after an administration that was so hostile for simply being brown in America.
And just to add to what was saying, when we testified under the Gathering for Justice for the 21st Century Task Force of Policing for Barack Obama, what we recommended was that we create a federal mandate on system accountability. What we have right now is we have departments across the country that we incentivize, especially because they're failing systems. And so a department like a Santa Cruz County that may reduce racial disparities, there was a project under the Latino Affairs Commission where they were trying to expand the detention center. And what we learned was that the young people that were predominantly incarcerated were all Latinos. They were coming from one area in the county that was a high school called Pajaro Valley High School. And so when we were able to look at the data and where people were coming from, we were able to say, hey, let's actually go into that high school and provide some alternatives to incarceration. Let's do some mediation. Let's organize with, let's collaborate with organizations organizations that are in the community to do some form of mediation, right? Also look at potentially removing the resource officer that is making these referrals into the detention center. But what was happening through the Latino Affairs Commission is that they were able to do these forums where the community was educated and empowered to take back their children. They said, if you are funneling our children into your detention center, we're not going to have it. And so therefore, you're not going to expand it. And through this series of sessions that were happening, the detention center was not necessarily expanded. Organizations got together to look at how to create alternatives to incarceration. And what happened is that there was also a mechanism on system accountability that led to the reduction of Latinos in the system. And so there are different mechanisms that could be created, whether it's through community forums, educational forums, looking at where referrals are coming from when it comes to either detention centers or jails or prisons. And then that's how we could begin to address the problems. If we don't have the data, then we don't have the information that will allow us to hold the system accountable. And so I think with things like that, also making sure that resources are provided to the organizations that are doing these type of wraparound services that Maria is talking about, because it's so important to welcome those that are impacted by incarceration back. And if the community is not ready and willing to or prepared to receive them, then we're only generating a cycle of incarceration in our communities.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you get to one of the follow-up questions that I had for that, which is, we talk a lot about coalition building, about collective power, because of how these issues affect different communities similarly. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what we've seen since some of the explosion of the social justice movement from last summer, where we did see solidarity between Latinos, members of the Black community who are also identify as Latino. And I wanted to ask specifically, Maria Teresa, maybe I'll ask this one of you first. What are some other ways that these communities of color can work to harness that power, build these coalitions? What are some of the similarities and goals that our communities have, and some ways to get there?
I think fundamentally it's this understanding that Black and Brown Latinos, Black and Brown communities are disproportionately targeted. And it is because of a structure that has been systemic and created to ensure that the white population rises. It basically maintains power. And the challenge that we're facing is that we are entering what I would consider a multicultural America that is disproportionately young. My children are the alpha generation. That means that there is part of a majority minority, and we have to start creating systems that accepts them for the totality of who they are. And when this tragic death of George Floyd happened, at Voto Latino, one thing we knew was that young Latinos were going to stand up in solidarity because their grievance was real. They had experienced very similar types of racial profiling. They knew of the story. If you have a focus group and you talk to, I don't even have to have a focus group, I can talk to my cousins, everyone knows someone who has died or has been mistreated by the hands of police. And it's rampant in the community, though we don't talk about it as much as we should. And as a result, when George Floyd happened, it wasn't a surprise that there was solidarity, because there's already so much pain, and they identified it far more ways than I think folks realize, especially under the hostility of Trump, where everybody felt that they were on pins and needles in this country, regardless of immigration status. And so one of the things that we hope to move forward is having these conversations of how we need criminal justice reform, making sure that now that we have someone in the administration who understands the importance of reform, not just with the president, but with the vice president, that we can create engagement, and that we start providing not just conversations, because they're very important, but policy solutions and resources. I think that one of the things that makes the program that Carmen was describing in Santa Cruz so brilliant is that it depended also on local community grassroots organizations, meeting people where they are, creating safe spaces. and destigmatizing this idea that if you were ever incarcerated and you have proven that you have, let's say you basically not proven, but basically you served your time, that you should be able to go in seamlessly back into society without that stigma. That means expunging your record so that people could actually find jobs and making sure that they have a shot of being enfranchised, of being at the voting booth. Those are the things that coalitions happen. If you see the coalition work that happened in Florida that allowed the enfranchisement of former felons, that's what we should be doing. A democracy only thrives if we have perfect participation from all our eligible citizens, and that eligibility has to reflect that once you have served time, that has been your sentence, and now you should become the ability to also be enfranchised with the voting booth to address the issues that impact you individually.
Carmen, I wanted to turn to you about a question regarding, how economic mobility for many Latinos comes through joining law enforcement in some cases. And I wanted to ask you about, what impact this has on communities, especially when, everyone has experiences with family members or loved ones through the justice system.
So I would be remiss not to recognize that the work that we do at the Gathering for Justice is a multicultural coalition. We've been doing Black and Brown solidarity work for over a decade. It's my life work. And so I just wanted to also contribute to the conversation around this idea of Black and Brown solidarity, especially because this was something that was provided to us and shared with us through the Chicano and the Black liberation movement of the 1960s, and people in organizations like Barrios Unidos or SIMBA, Safe in My Brother's Arms, that have continued to lead the fight, and understanding that what happened in George Floyd also happened to Eric Salgado, to Sean Monterosa, and to Andres Gallardo, right? Immediately after the killing of George Floyd, there were 3 Latinos killed in the state of California. And we've been organizing at the Gathering for Justice over a decade, showing up for BLM, for Black Lives Matter, also making sure that as we are saying George Floyd, we're also saying Sean Monterosa. And we're also recognizing Anthony Baez, who was killed over 20 years ago and whose mother has been fighting for 2 decades to receive justice for her son. And so our fight is also, we often talk about, this issue also being a Latino issue, but we also have been working in collaboration, in support, in coalition with our Black siblings. And the Gathering for Justice is also Black and Brown led. It's also API led. And so I just wanted to share that, especially because it's so important that we also acknowledge the work that we've been doing for quite some time. But in regards to economic mobility, I think a lot about, when I was going into prisons in California, and a lot of the people that were correctional officers also had family members that were incarcerated. And there's actually a highway in California called Highway 5, Highway 99, which is called Prison Valley. And so what we do know is that, oftentimes recruiters are coming into our communities offering these type of jobs as our only option. Prisons are being built in our communities as the only option for economic mobility, or to actually have being the only place where Latinos can afford to live and have the ability to have a job. And so either policing or corrections is one of the only options for a job with decent pay in a lot of the communities that we have been interacting with. And so I think about also the Border Patrol agents, the U.S. Army, the police, talking earlier about how those recruiters show up at our schools to recruit youth. And often that seems as the most viable option for young people, especially when our families don't have the ability to send us to college. There can also be some pull to assimilate, to show patriotism in a country where Latinos are also still othered and not seen as American. I heard earlier, Latinos are the new American. Well, we've actually always been American. If we look at the history of this country and the beginning of policing from the Texas Rangers, this land was taken taken from us. And so we also know that oftentimes people are recruited, especially when they're looking for bilingual officers, or they're trying to have people. Now with this whole diversity and inclusion, we're also centering the voices of people that are most impacted. But also we're creating more tension in some of our homes and spaces, because oftentimes you do have that probation officer or that correctional officer who's overseeing their cousin in that facility. I saw that at Tracy Prison firsthand. And, somebody, I remember walking with the correctional officer to go meet with some men, and he said, I've been doing time with my cousin for 20 years. And so it's not an easy topic. But again, I think what we can do is that we could educate, we could offer resources to our communities. We could educate our people about how this is also our issue. We could share with our communities that policing has been part of the beginning of the American history, and we've always been a target in this country. And so it's people like Maria, it's people like myself, like the Nanes, like the Alex Sanchez's, that have been working in this field for quite some time, that can be part of those conversations and those strategies in order for us to actually provide solutions to our communities.
Absolutely. Well, Carmen, Maria Teresa, that's all the time we have. So thank you so much for being here and sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
It's great to see you both. Be well.
For our final conversation on closing the Latino wealth gap, please welcome Beatriz Acevedo, CEO and co-founder of Sumo Wealth, Mark Hugo Lopez, Director of Race and Ethnicity Research, Pew Research Center, and Sarah Rodriguez, President of the National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals. Returning to lead the conversation is Atlantic Assistant Editor Christian Paz.
Beatriz, Sarah, and Mark, thank you all for joining us today. Let's jump right in. Generally speaking, the biggest contributors to increasing wealth and income are earning a college degree, buying a home, or establishing a business. And in recent years, Latinos have been doing all of those in record numbers. But they're still behind their peers when it comes to increasing wealth and income. And the pandemic didn't really help with that. So Beatriz, I wanted to turn to you first. We know that Latinos have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, but how much of that has righted itself and how much of that has yet to rebound?
Well, I don't have the specific stats with me on particularly on the pandemic and how much we've rebounded so far. I mean, we all know that the numbers were devastating, not just health-wise, but also with the loss of jobs and a lot of businesses from our very entrepreneurial community. Something that I'm very certain is that Latinos have always been incredibly resourceful and resilient and hardworking, and we will rebound from this crisis as we have from many others. But the focus that I personally have, as I know my fellow panelists do as well, and many people from our Latino community, is to really help them accelerate that recovery, right? We will recover, there is no question about it, but what are we doing very intentionally to help our community rebound faster? As you mentioned, the numbers when it comes to being enrolled in college, entering the workforce, starting more companies, all those numbers to matter to the American economy as a whole, not only to Latinos, are critically driven by our community. So we need to support Latinos, and we need to make sure Latinos do well for America to do well as well. There is no prosperous future for Americans in general if Latinos don't do well. So we need to be very mindful and very intentional, particularly when we talked about youth. We see that that is where the growth is coming from our country. That is where the GDP growth is coming. So we need to make sure that this cohort thrives for everybody to thrive as well.
Sarah, I wanted to ask you about, some of the things that Latinos can do for themselves now when it comes to, building wealth through real estate, or when it comes to being, building up, savings or investments. What can Latinos do to position themselves to be more resilient financially in the future?
Absolutely. So let's just start with the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually showed that in April 2020, 1 in 5 Latina workers were unemployed. Those are some incredible statistics, just like Beatriz was saying. Even though a lot of Latinas have been able to go back to work, the numbers are showing that Latina workers are at a higher unemployment number than they've ever been in their life. So we're talking about how to close the wealth gap. And the only real equalizer is going to be through real estate. We have done at NAREP, which is an organization where we're the voice of Latinos with home ownership, and we truly believe that that's the way that we can close the wealth gap, because all the studies show that of the Latino wealth, 33% comes out of home equity. 14% comes out of business equity and 15% out of retirement account. In fact, when we've done all of these studies, and not just us, but other organizations, they've shown that in the last 10 years, Latino wealth has increased by 84.9%. And it's not a surprise that in the last 10 years, the only demographic that keeps growing in their homeownership numbers is the Latino community. Now, if that isn't enough, let me tell you a couple more things. Did you know that the average net worth of Latino renters is $6,210, whereas the net worth of a Latino homeowner is $171,900? That's 28 times more of net worth when you are a homeowner. Now, of course, the wealth gap is still incredible. If we look at our non-Hispanic white counterparts, non-white homeowner counterpart, their net worth is $299,900, which is an incredible gap that we're trying to address. So the good news is that Latinos are a very young demographic, and we're starting, just like Beatriz said, we have to focus on our youth. We are starting as a demographic to come into our money earning age, when we have to focus on that home ownership, because that's the way where we're really going to be able to compound that interest, to be able to then invest and buy more real estate, or invest in our retirement account, or start investing in our businesses, because that's something that's really going to be helpful. Now, in order to be able to do that, we can't just address, hey, this is a magic pill. We need to invest in home ownership so that the Latino wealth gap can decrease. Just like Beatriz was saying, we need to absolutely start looking at legislation and policies that are coming down the pipeline, and how these are going to affect the access to credit and home ownership that our demographic has.
Definitely. I wanted to turn to Mark now. When we talk about Latinos in the labor force, it's projected that about 1 out of 5 workers in the U.S. will be Latino by 2030, according to the Department of Labor. Where is this growth coming from? What are some of the job sectors that are benefiting the most?
It's a great question, and there's a lot of change underway. The nation's Hispanic population, as you know, numbers about 62.1 million, according to the 2020 census. But what's interesting about the Latino population in the U.S. is its relative youth. And listening to some of the other panels, youth has come up as an important part of the Latino story in this country today. So, for example, about 1 million young Latinos turn 18 every year. Most of them are U.S. born. And that's really, I think, one of the interesting parts of the story, the economic story of this population, that a lot of the change is being driven by Latinos who are born here in the United States, who've gone to school here, maybe even gone to college here, and are all entering the job force here as other Americans do. So there's a real interesting U.S. born component to this. Now, immigration in the past had been a big part of the Latino employment story, and it continues to be an important part of the story. About half of all Latino adults, for example, and half of all Latino workers are immigrants. But a lot of the growth is coming from U.S.-born young Latinos entering the workforce, entering adulthood for the first time. So homeownership, establishing businesses, going to college, establishing families, having children, those are all things that are still to come for a significant part of the nation's Hispanic population. Now, where is this growth happening? Well, with all these changes, you're starting to see, for example, some of the most important growth coming in white-collar jobs, so office workers, for example. In fact, that's the single largest occupational group among Hispanic workers today, not farm workers, not construction workers, not transportation workers, which in the past had been the largest segments of the Hispanic workforce. But things are changing as Hispanics get more education, as it becomes a more U.S. born workforce, and as it becomes a more integrated part of the U.S. economy. So it's interesting to see some of these changes, and I think we're going to continue to see them into the future with U.S. born Latinos driving a lot of that change.
Absolutely. And staying with that, Mark, I wanted to show this quick graphic that shows some of those top industries for Latinos. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of these findings, and if these industries are expected to continue to grow the fastest, will these be the occupations that we see more Latinos, filtering into?
Yeah, so this is really a great graphic. Thank you for sharing this. And as you can see, Office Administrative Support is the single largest group, though again, there's a distribution here. There's no single occupation category that majority of Latino workers are in. But some of the growth is coming in Office Administrative Support. Some of it is coming in sales. Of course, some of it is also coming in transportation and material moving and food preparation and serving. And as we know, the pandemic had a big impact on that last group, particularly as people who work in restaurants and also people who work in hospitality have lost a number of jobs and have not quite yet recovered in terms of their employment. But looking forward, a lot of the growth for the nation is going to come in positions that are going to be like office and administrative support, in finance, in science. If you notice, science and finance are not on this list, but they are occupations that are seeing growth among Latinos in the last few years. And that is, again, reflecting some of the changes in the population. Even so, Latinos are less represented in some of the higher tech, more education-focused professions than other groups of Americans, but those things are changing as Latinos make progress in educational attainment.
Absolutely. Beatriz, I wanted to turn to you. I know from my own experience, financial literacy is something that, can be a bit of a taboo topic in some Latino families and communities. Banks may not necessarily be trusted, or money in general is something that's not the first thing that's discussed in the household. How do we break that cycle? How do we motivate Latino families, young Latinos to, learn more about financial literacy, learn more about options when it comes to saving and investing? How do we break that taboo?
Sure. Well, as you know, I'm a big proponent on youth, right? So again, I have my eyes set on the Zillennials, on the Gen Zs and younger millennials, because they have been those Sherpas, those influencers, those navigators for their older family members, particularly for the older, more immigrant family members. So I think we need to start with them. I mean, the focus, they are so ready also to learn more. They want to know how to invest. They want to know more about home ownership, but they've just never had that relative, that family member that is an expert in building wealth or in finance or in how you plan for your retirement. So we need to really focus on that demographic. And for me, it's very important that anything that we do with financial literacy, that we don't do it in language, but that we do it in culture. I think that's been the problem of financial institutions and even the recent fintechs that can be very successful with other demos. But if you think about who owns Latino youth when it comes to a financial brand, there's really nobody that really stands out. I hope to become that brand at Summa Wealth. But the thing that we are doing differently is exactly that, to really tell our community that they belong in the money conversation, that talking about money is okay, that building wealth is okay, that el dinero no es el diablo, like we heard from our grandmothers, right? Money is not evil. And we need to start with that youth. So we need to do things that are in culture. We need to change that cycle, that rightfully so. All of us have post-traumatic syndrome. I remember very vividly when my parents lost everything to a massive devaluation when they thought they had US dollar bank accounts in Mexico because they lived in the border, and the president just said there's no more dollars in this country and your bank accounts are now pesos after a massive devaluation. So that distrust continues to carry on generations. So we need to break that cycle. We really need to make sure that our kids are not doing the same as our abuelitas or our moms or our dads, putting money under the colchón. That is just obviously losing money every single day to inflation. And we need to make them comfortable. We need to make them really understand, the power that they have with being financially savvy, and do it with brands that they absolutely trust. So my bet again is on the youth. They are those influencers. They are those navigators in their family. They've been the accountants, the attorneys, everything else, translating the American ethos literally and figuratively for their older family members. So putting a bet on them, we have seen how it's never a one-to-one ROI. It's always one-to-many. You teach one young Latino anything, but particularly something around finance or wealth building, and you see how much they'll spread that knowledge among their other family members and community. So my bets are on the youth, and my bets are on education that is culturally relevant and not particularly just translated to Spanish, as we know many of our youth prefer to consume their content in English.
Yeah, staying on this topic of youth, Latino youth, Sarah, I wanted to turn to you. When it comes to home ownership, we've seen that Latinos have accounted for over half the nation's population growth in the last decade, and it's not reflected just in cities with high costs of living. We see more Latinos are moving to mountain towns, to smaller southern cities, to the Midwest. And I have a graphic here to show where some of these states that have seen the largest growth in Latino population over the last decade. I wanted to ask you, Latinos are part of this fast-growing group of new homeowners. It's a sign of prosperity. What's driving that surge? How do we keep the surge going? And especially, since we focus so much sometimes on big cities, how we focus on some of these smaller towns, Midwestern, regions in the South also.
Sure. Well, Latinos are moving where it's affordable. Throughout today, and how Beatriz was saying, that we're talking about when you say to one, the ROI is many. Well, it's the same thing with home ownership. When you see that, one of the biggest things about Latinos is that they see home ownership not just as something that's going to create wealth for them, but as their final American dream, as their definition of success. Once they come into this country and they're able to afford a home, that is their definition of I'm successful and I'm part of this country. As well, they want to make it as part of the community. So once they move into an area, they want to have their cousins, their family members all come and create a community around them so that they can support each other. What we're seeing is that as the cities numbers are going higher and higher, and it becomes less affordable. And with a lot of these works, just like we saw on the other slide, where Latinos are starting to go into other employment that doesn't require transportation or just being in person, we're going to start seeing them actually go into areas that are more affordable so that they can grow their communities. This is the thing. We've talked about it all day. The thing is that Latinos are starting to go into their homebuyer years. They're starting to actually go into career years, into wealth building years. So it's important for us not to only understand that these are great vehicles, because financial education is great. Knowing your numbers are great. Knowing that homeownership is the best way of achieving wealth in a fast way. But the problem is that we need to address those barriers that Latinos are still having. A lot of these statistics have shown that in the next 20 years, 70% of the new home buyers are going to be Latinos. That's great, and that's going to be great for our economy and for our community. But if we don't address the barriers that we're seeing, like access to credit or, affordable housing, we are not going to see our community thrive with the potential that we could have. So we're seeing them start, the ones that can move into more affordable areas, but a lot of them are still tied to the jobs that they have, which are in higher areas that cost more. So we need to address these things in order to be able to fully allow our community to reach the potential that we have.
And I had one follow-up for you, Beatriz. When it comes to Latinos and the growth of small businesses, we do hear that Latino entrepreneurs sometimes can't fund some of those ventures with just personal savings or family money the way some peers do. Is lack of capital the only barrier to starting some of those businesses, or are there other factors that should be highlighted as well?
Yeah, lack of capital is not the only barrier. Thankfully, we are seeing more Latinos and Latinas be fund managers. So in the past, where we had no option to find an investor that looked like us and that really understood the problems we were solving with our own new ventures, now we see plenty of them, particularly Latinas, which makes me incredibly proud to see so many Latina fund owners, fund managers. So that's going to change for the better for our community that has had a really hard time accessing capital. If you think about it, we're always like in the less of 1% of being able to access capital from outside sources that are not family driven. But I also think a very big barrier is being able to have those introductions. In the venture world, they call them warm introductions. So you're not emailing somebody cold or reaching through a LinkedIn cold that tends to be a little bit less effective. So people outside of our community have had those connections, those contacts, those resources for many, many generations, and they continue to have that advantage. So I think in our community, I'm very big advocate that if you are a Latino leader who has had that privilege to sit on these boards, to have access to these venture funds, to have access to anything that's going to support our Latino community, that you put in the time to open those doors. It's very, very, and there is room for everybody to thrive. I think a lot of the older generation Latinos feel that it's been so hard for them to do it on their own. Nobody helped me, so I'm not going to bring somebody else to the board to take my place. Yes, we should do that. There's going to be a time where your time is up and the time for the new generations is here. So I do that every single day. So I think aside of capital, I think those connections, I think those introductions are very, very critical. And the mentorship, the peer-to-peer mentorship or the peer mentorship that you can give somebody from a younger generation. But in the same way that we were talking earlier, that we are placing our bets on our youth when it comes to financial education, we also need to place our bets on the youth of the next generation of entrepreneurs. And whoever in our community, which there are very few of us who've had the privilege to raise capital and have those connections, it is our responsibility to open those doors and bring up that next generation along with us. So I would say be mindful of both the capital and then obviously those connections that can be transformational for somebody in our community and for potentially a generation to come in their own family.
Absolutely. We have an audience question for you, Beatriz, on that topic. Can you identify any resources for Latina women who are interested in investing? I feel like that's definitely a topic that a lot of folks are interested in.
Sure. So there's two ways of investing. I think the one that excites me the most is that now anybody can start investing via fractional shares. And we have free resources on a particular class on this on our Zoom Academy. So if anybody is interested in taking this class for free, it's zoomacademy.org, and you can learn a little bit more. So now you're able to start investing with as little as $1. And these are fractional shares. So if you think about a share, you're able to buy a fraction of that share with any kind of money. Before, you had to be accredited investor. So the answer is two. I'm not assuming that people only have $1 to invest. You might want to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that is a different way to invest if you're an accredited investor. Now, we've been shut out of sort of like that group because not every Latino has had a net worth of over $1 million, not including your home. So before, a few years back, only accredited investors were able to be in the money-making game of investing. Today, we have the opportunity through fractional shares to be able to not need to be a accredited investor. So absolutely anybody can invest, and you invest a fraction of those shares. I'm a very big advocate, particularly with the holidays coming up, that we start having a different mindset in our community, going from consumers to investors. We know we are the biggest consumers. We know that we are driving that GDP and that it's extraordinary for the economy. But we also need to change that mindset of, okay, I am the biggest consumer of this brand I love. How about also being a shareholder? How about teaching your children that for the holidays, instead of giving them 4 toys, maybe you give them 1 or 2, and then the rest could be shares on thing and some brand that they love. So the more that you support that, you are supporting your own company. And that's when we talk about changing that mindset of the youth. I even do it with my own mother, right? I mean, she's such a lover of these massive discount stores, La Rose, La Marshalls. I'm like, perfect. I'm going to, instead of giving you a gift card of those stores, I'm going to give you fractional shares and you'll be a shareholder. So I think changing that mentality in our community of going from consumer to shareholder is critical. And continue to support the brands that you love, but you know that you are contributing to that as a shareholder. So there's a lot to unpack, and we don't have enough time to talk about investing, but the great news is that investing is now for everyone, and anybody with $1 in their hand can start investing today. If you do have the net worth of over $1 million, not counting your home, there are certainly other ways that you can invest that have been available for our communities for many years. And happy to share our resource or any other resource. The ones that we have at the SUMA Academy are 100% free, and it's part of our nonprofit effort to get the word out.
Well, we're running out of time, so I wanted to get a few more questions in while we have Mark. I wanted to ask you, there are a lot of facts and figures out there on employment, income inequality, but among those, which should be the most important that we look at when looking at Latinos' recovery from the pandemic and then economic power moving forward?
So, of course, the big number is to look at the unemployment rate. That's, I think, an important measure because right before the pandemic, the Latino unemployment rate was at a historic low. It hit 18% overall in April of 2020. It's now at around 5.9%. But that's not the whole story because not everybody who lost a job has decided to return to the workforce. So in other ways, we need to look at, as you noted, income inequality. Not only the household income of Latino households compared to other groups such as white Americans or Black Americans or Asian Americans, but also even within the Latino population, because there is also rising income inequality within our population overall. You'll see that those who are educated and who have resources have been doing well during the pandemic, while those who have less resources at their disposal have done worse. So when looking at these, the two measures that you just pointed to, I think are important ones to consider, which is unemployment rates, but also that doesn't tell the whole story, but also income inequality, because that's one place where we see rising income inequality within the country, but also among Latinos themselves.
And one last thing, what changes in wealth and income, the wealth and income gap, can the next generation expect? And, how can we speed up, closing that gap when we look at some of these markers of success, education or wealth building investments?
So as we've been tracking at the Pew Research Center for some time now, Latinos have made great progress in finishing high school, bringing down that high school dropout rate, and going to college. In fact, they're more likely to go to college than, say, their equivalent white counterparts when it comes to the share of high school graduates who choose to go to college in the fall immediately following their graduation. But also what's interesting is that we're seeing a growing number of Latinos, particularly Latinas, finish their college degrees. That means, when you look at this, that Latinos are poised to see improvements in their economic situation over the course of the coming decades, and that's partly because they're better educated, they're starting out their work lives, but they're also, with that a higher level of education, poised to earn more and do better than, say, previous generations may have done because of the important role that education plays in the U.S. economy. So looking forward, I think we're going to see continued educational attainment improvements. They're on track for that. We're going to continue to see more Latinos than ever going to college, and I think you're going to start to see some payoffs in the labor market as Latinos pursue opportunities and build wealth in ways that perhaps previous generations were less able to do so. So I think it's a really interesting and potentially a bright future for the Latino population.
Well, unfortunately, panel, this is all the time that we have. We could keep going. It's such an interesting and important topic for us. But Mark, Sarah, Beatriz, I want to thank each of you so much for being here. And thank you to all of you watching at home. We encourage you to network with other attendees, visit our virtual expo booths, and please visit our website for more information on future live events. Thank you so much for being here.
While we're on a break, we encourage you to network with other attendees and visit our expo booths. To participate, select the networking icon located on the left-hand side of the screen. Next, click Join, and you'll be randomly paired with another attendee for about 5 minutes. If you wish, you can exchange virtual information with each other and keep in contact via direct message within the platform. You can also click the Explore icon to visit our virtual expo booths. Here you can explore more resources from the Atlantic and our underwriters related to today's event. We'll see you shortly after the break.